everybody. Thanks for coming. I love this intimate room, and it's nice and quiet. So I think we have a really good discussion here prepared for you, and not opposed to a question or two if we have time. So think of those as we go along. I'm going to introduce myself just briefly, although I guess Jonathan did a great job. But I'm with the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. We're a neutral home for open source technologies and communities that are building technologies serving this space. And I want to invite our panels to do just a brief intro so people know a little bit kind of the perspective you're coming from into this topic.
So my name is Joe Cutler, and as you said, I'm the chair of the firm's blockchain and cryptocurrency group. And I'm a privacy lawyer by training, I am a crypto lawyer by passion, and a fintech lawyer by necessity. And I'm also very grateful to President Trump for you all knowing how to pronounce my firm's name.
My name is Chang, founder and CEO of SpruceID. Our mission is to let users control their data. Instead of you signing into the platform should ask you for permission to access your data vault. And you share what you choose or rescind it, right? So that's how we want the internet to work. We made something called Sign In with Ethereum, which is how a lot of the Ethereum ecosystem logs into a website without a Google or an Apple in the middle. And also, we build the California State Digital Identity Program with over 1 million issued identities that people can use to board airplanes, and we're figuring out how to make it financial grade, work with a few other states.
Hi, I'm Carole House. I've worked across the U.S. government in different roles, really wherever bad guys are using tech to hurt people. It's kind of where I've tried to serve. So I just left my second tour at the National Security Council, and then I've also spent time working on the Hill and at FinCEN, our anti-money laundering regulator, and the agency responsible for KYC obligations, where I led crypto and emerging tech policy.
Awesome. Like I said, it's an awesome group. This panel's about regaining trust in the digital age, but I thought it'd be helpful for this audience, as I know we've got a lot of people coming from different backgrounds and understandings of digital ID. If the panel could help walk us through just sort of the evolution of digital identity, infrastructure, what's driven progress, what's held it back so far, and particularly in the US context.
All right. It's very hard to build a business and identity because it means so many things to different people. But the kind of term that seems to be least controversial is the way that we recognize, remember, and respond to people and things. Right? It's so broad that it covers a ton of things. And most useful is when you look at a particular use case. Right? So if you're using your passport at the airport, that's for getting into a country or boarding an airplane for security. If you're looking at presenting your documents for financial transactions, that's for a different purpose, right? So identity as we use it today has been defined by all the places where we can use it and where it's accepted, right? And I think from that lens, the acceptance of identity for different use cases that are important really drive the adoption of it or not. And as excited as we can get about the technology and the way that we implement it, the driving factor is what can you use it for, right? So it's really use cases that are going to build identity up block by block, and it's been cooking for a while, but I think that if you look at current trends, I think that there are 11 states in the US that have digital identity programs. It's on track to double probably by the end of the year, right? So more and more Americans will be able to access their identity. Europe has their EU digital identity initiatives. I think by 2027, all member states ought to have digital identity for their residents or citizens. Japan, China, India, they all have different systems built in different ways, and it'll be interesting to poke through some of the nuances of the different systems.
I would add that, you know, when I introduced myself, it's a little cheeky, but the truth is that I did start my career as a privacy lawyer, and in particular, I still am a privacy lawyer, but my initial work in the privacy space was on the litigation side. So I was helping companies protect people's data when it was compromised. So, for example, I ran the enforcement program for companies like Facebook. And when people would misbehave on their platform, our job at the firm was to send nasty letters to the people doing it and tell them to stop, and if they didn't, we'd sue them or refer them to law enforcement. And one of the problems is that you know, the world made a really big bet on sort of privacy in the late 90s, early 2000s when free services were invented, Hotmail, Gmail. I mean, Gmail's big entrance into the world was based on giving you free service. I still pay for my Hotmail, by the way. but free service in exchange for your data. And that's really the value proposition. So when you use anything that's free on the internet, 90% of the time, you are paying them for that service with your data. And I've had a front row seat into what data aggregation, data consolidation, data centralization has done, and there's an underbelly to it. And so when I was introduced to decentralized ledger technology, for me, it wasn't the financial side, it was the data side that made my light bulb turn on. And like, oh, this is really, really cool. And so I think the thing that's holding us back, that was your question, is I do think that people have unconsciously lost trust that people have their best interests in mind with their data. And the replacement technology is so new that I don't think people yet know whether they can trust it any better.
Yeah, I love, the really interesting vantage point of like product creator, like someone who's trying to solve these problems for people, and then you've seen the evolution of privacy policy, and which is such an important component of identity discussions, and not everybody always gets that right. I love that as part of highlighting really this evolution and arc where like we've had some privacy legislation in the U.S. since like 1978 was the first privacy law, right? But that was about government using your data. That is certainly not comprehensive privacy legislation at the federal level that we do not have and have long needed. And so the challenges that we've seen where you mentioned that there was a big doubling down on privacy investment. There was in some ways, but the people that were also creating the backbone of the internet, there was a lot of like, we'll fix privacy. Don't worry. You don't need to regulate us for this. And then ultimately, we've gotten to the point where like, okay, it's a lot harder to patch on those fixes later rather than building it in up front. And why it's interesting in the Web3 space to see that a lot of the developers are trying to think through how to build in those features up front, recognizing that that's what they want for the future of a decentralized internet, right? Is to build in those practical features that they want, that they feel like we're missing in the first one. Interesting that they chose a technology that publishes your information publicly to a ledger, or publishes certain information to a public ledger. So it's I guess there's a lot of really interesting dynamics that are ongoing, and the issue that you mentioned about trust in institutions is really at the heart of why we've not seen broader consumer adoption, and there's an aversion really on both sides of the aisle to terms like digital identity because it invokes very Black Mirror type scenarios of social credit scores and things that people are afraid of, and identity theft and stuff. We've seen where most cybercrime is targeting weaknesses in identity because we've not built in the infrastructure that we need for secure and trustworthy identity. So all these things lead to a lack of trust, and if you don't have trust, then identity's not very useful.
To just quickly add to that, like I think one really interesting lens for privacy is looking at it from, if you have sufficient control over your data, then you get privacy as a side effect, right? Because you can control where it goes and where it doesn't go. So from that lens, what are the impediments to user control over data? I think we're seeing a lot of important shifts recently. For example, it used to be that only a few companies could basically cough up the engineers and the cloud costs and the data centers to host everyone's data for cheap or free. But now you can go to AWS or anywhere and compute a lot of it for pretty cheap. There was less emphasis on it because things just worked, but now think about how are you going to move your chat history from one bot to another bot, right? Like that's actually very personal, and people are starting to see that, it would be nice to actually have control over those aspects. So I think it's surfacing in many ways. And finally, we're seeing the availability of consumer cryptography. Secure elements on the phones, you see it with passkeys, you see it with the next generation of crypto applications, how easy it is, and you don't have to write down your 12 words anymore in some systems, right? So we're getting there in a lot of ways.
So my next question was going to be more about the title of the panel is about, what caused us to lose trust. But I was just thinking as you all were talking, like, has trust been lost? Like, I think there could be a debate around that. I think there's some elements, some people would say yes, but I think a lot of people do trust, right? And are okay with, Hotmail or whatever using their information. So what do you all think about that the debate around that, and if we have lost trust broadly, what can we do to regain that?
I love it's a great point, and I think also even in the crypto space, when the term trustless has been used a lot in this space, and I don't really think it's trustless. It's about who or what we're choosing to trust. So it's just trusting something different in software and other types of of functions and intermediaries rather than the normal institutions that really drove why Bitcoin was created in the first place in 2008 and 9. So I think it's a really apt point, an incisive one about that. I think that trust in the U.S. certainly Americans do not trust the government with their data the same way that we're much more fine with giving lots of information to companies to use my data for for a second of additional user convenience. I am glad that I think that there's some people recognizing that they would like to be able to transition it into more of a control of data and monetization of that. Why I love some of the vision that comes in some of the Web3 re-envisionings of what the internet could look like. But I do think that certainly trust in the government and other types of institutions, there have been some losses. Some of the ways that you can establish trust is through regulation. Some of it can be self-regulation, that is an approach. But then also I think that as you get a population that gets more tech savvy, that recognizes the utility of things, and as they start seeing information used responsibly, that's going to be a good hallmark of something that will help certainly something like the cryptocurrency industry, and digital identity is, I think, going to be a part of that. A federal government administered digital identity is not going to be a future. I don't think anytime soon, maybe ever in the United States, because people just don't trust that. But people do they trust their DMVs, that they go and they get their driver's license. I think that the government needs to think very hard, including state governments, about how they build trust when it's a digital credential that gets issued. Because even if they can cryptographically prove that I'm not tracing your data and there is no phone home capability to see every time that you present your ID card, even if I can prove it, getting them to believe it and the messaging is not something that the government's always gotten right.
I would plus one to that, in that if we were to invest in one area more as we work with these different government stakeholders, it's broader messaging. How do you get the public, convinced that it does have the promises built in of privacy and control. And another great point is the decentralization of identity as it is today, right? Where's your birth certificate if you're from here, or where your immigration documents? They're in the county office, they're in some state agency, there are a whole bunch of other sources that are already decentralized. And that is a much more resilient model in my mind than having just one issuer of who gives to issue the identity or not, which is a lot of models that we see in China and India. And to their credit, we've seen in India 2005 to 2015, 500 million bank accounts opened because they solved identity, but different area, different expectation from civil society, different expectation of control over data, right?
So I want to flip part of that on its head and just sort of make an observation, which is I don't know that we're trending towards trust at all. I think we're trending towards assumption. I got 3 kids entering adulthood right now. I've got a 23-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 17-year-old. And I am amazed at how little they trust anything. They don't trust the media. They don't trust the news. They don't trust things they learn in school. They don't trust history books. They don't trust history itself as it's been presented to them. They don't trust images because they've been lied to a lot, right? And we have maximal information and minimal truth in their eyes. And so I don't think that there is an increased amount of trust. I think there's an increase in assumptions. They assume a lot. And so, for example, they just assume the media is lying to them. They assume that big companies are screwing them. They assume the government can't be trusted. They assume the government's lying to them. And so I think we should deal with that. And it's not surprising to me that when someone, as decentralized digital technology reached a point where the purveyors of that could approach the TSA and actually give an alternative to presenting your driver's license at a checkpoint. I mean, y'all know what happened? Apple and Google immediately went and secured contracts with every TSA company out there to be digital ID. They've locked it down for 20 years. No one's going to be able to do that if they lock those things down. They are now going to be the sole providers of digital ID at the checkpoints at airports. And how does that connect to my kids? My kids are like, well, I have to assume that Google's going to do what Google's going to do, or that Apple's going to do what Apple's going to do. And that's not a pejorative statement. It's just that is a truth that our generation just assumes that it's not possible not to give your data to big companies because they have a lot of power. And so I guess what I love, Wayne, what you said is like I think we do trust things like the DMV. Right, we do trust localized organizations that we can see and touch that we think are, okay, you guys are you're doing one thing. And one thing I like about decentralized technology is we could build a reverse IP, the phone home point. If we could find a way to let us as people phone home to the institutions that we trust and verify things, you don't have to centralize it like self-sovereignly, but at least you can improve the connections with people you do trust.
Yeah, one of the reasons why we built, so in California, there are 3 wallets where you can have your digital identity. There's the Apple wallet, the Google wallet, and the California DMV wallet. That is on track to be open source. And the reason why we built that 3rd wallet was to always have an option in a separate privacy policy that really limits what is collected and used and retained, right? Because having that 3rd option is very important for the public sector to be able to say, okay, you could do it this way, right? And there's always a different option. You're not relying on a product manager who has to product manage for 1 billion other users, right? To get your thing for your state through. So that's part of the really important point for interoperability, so that if you just have any wallet that you choose and it plugs in, right, it works. I think that's the direction that I would like to see these things trend, instead of consolidation.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that the things that we feel are closer to home, we trust more. And maybe it's a matter of then getting people to really understand these new systems and how they can't be corrupted or used nefariously as much, perhaps, to bring that trust back. I want to talk about then, building on that, what is the appropriate role then for government in the public sector in enabling privacy-preserving digital identity, especially as these bottom-up, open-source, decentralized systems and models start to come into play. And actually, if one of you could briefly actually just clarify the difference between centralized and decentralized identity, because we've started to throw that out there, and sometimes digital ID and decentralized ID are used interchangeably, but they're very, very, very different things. So yeah, what do you think is the appropriate role in government? And what are the key gaps in policy and tech implementation?
This might be a really good opportunity to bring up Utah Senate Bill 260, which was a pretty recent piece of legislation. I think it made it through both the Senate and the House in Utah, and I think it's waiting signing, and we don't see any major impediments, but we'll see. But I'd say that this is one of the most decentralized identity systems we've seen proposed as a framework. It doesn't actually authorize the construction of a system, but it lays the rules of the road if there is such a system in the future. And the main message there is that you already have an identity. The government doesn't assign you one. You're a human and you exist, right? But what the government may do is endorse the fact that you're a specific human and give it to you in a certain way if they choose, right? And you can use it for purposes like financial or identification for boarding an airplane, et cetera, right? So that's kind of the mentality, instead of, agency defines who you are. So very interesting idea that for decentralized identity, you already exist and you just want to collect aspects about yourself that you can reuse in different circumstances, versus kind of a central system which defines everything hierarchically, right? And like an enterprise system where there is a system administrator for the whole system. Right? So I'd say that that's some of the contrast that I'm seeing, and both are useful in different contexts. But for purposes of civil society, I think that I lean more towards decentralized.
Yeah, I really appreciate the point that you brought up, Joe, about this, like, the assumptions, or like that we've moved more to acceptance rather than trust, that like people aren't happy about, forking over a lot of their data, especially when they're not being monetized for it, but it's just sort of accepting that that's the case because it's industry doing it more than Gov. I think that driving more towards like outcomes and proving that to Americans, and on the issue that you brought up about competitiveness, I think that's where like that kind of consolidation is not what the government's supposed to be allowing through our contracts issuance. It's like there are other things like antitrust and other controls, because like those are the sorts of things that we want to be able to foster, because unchecked capitalism can tend towards monopoly. Like, and the same in crypto, right? Like you have to deliberately build in decentralization, because generally the earth just sort of bends towards centralization, I think. And so it takes proactive people deliberately choosing to build in and ensure that decentralized governance, because I think that inertia just can drive that. So I think that on the role of the government, besides making sure that we're meeting those objectives in a responsible way, I think that making sure that the government accepts privacy-preserving identities, that was part of the executive order on strengthening and promoting innovation in cybersecurity that the White House issued on January 16th, that we were, like, it was very specific, concrete steps where we stated, okay, the federal government should accept and promote the acceptance of, or the acceptance of privacy-preserving digital identity solutions, only if they meet the standards that the federal government and industry worked together with to create on things like mobile driver's licenses, to ensure and protect against privacy violations and ensure that they're properly secure. I think that the federal government needing to make sure that they demand the highest standards of privacy in the kinds of identities that they accept, and then promoting things like standards and grants and research and R&D, like all of those things, and then also our regulatory frameworks, making sure that there's clarity about the kind of identities that can be used in centralized and decentralized systems, which doesn't, that in the case of regulation, it will also demand sort of directly confronting the fact that privacy doesn't always mean anonymity, and it can mean and demand some level of discoverability.
I'd like to give an example of where it could be really helpful for the government to play a role. So if you've ever been through a KYC workflow, you might have done the thing where you held up your license or your passport in front of the webcam, where you could activate none of the security features in that card. The UV activated lighting, the bending and the flex and the holograms. Just a completely inappropriate medium, and it's surprising that we've gotten so far as an industry on that alone, right? So now that we've got AI to generate images, they're gonna generate you holding your card, right? So what of those systems? So I think that trust is gonna fall off the precipice, because none of those systems are gonna work anymore, and we're just gonna have to really aggressively switch to systems built on cryptography and systems where people had to show up in person, because AIs can't do either of those things just yet.
The only thing I'd add is just as a summation, I agree with that, and that is a scary world, right? But what I would say is, your question about what is the role of the government, I mean, they build the track, they set the rules, but they don't pick the horses. And I think that's an important, metaphor to keep in mind, that, it's just an important, I think that's, asking yourself what is the proper role is a fair and important question to ask.
And that applies to almost everything, right? Not just this topic. Wayne, you talked about relying more on cryptography, and there's, zero knowledge proofs is being discussed as a solution to privacy, because we can talk about privacy, but how do we actually do it? And this, with these decentralized technologies, what should policymakers know about zero knowledge proofs, and what should they be paying attention to or thinking about from that technology?
All right, so I think we talked about me using a little story. So I'm going to tell the briefest of stories, and I attribute it to Ari Yu. Some of you know Ari. Ari tells this story, so this is not my story, but it's one that I love. She was in college, and she went to a bar with some friends, and she presented her driver's license to the bouncer, and that was ostensibly because she needed to demonstrate she was over 21. And when she went home that night, the bouncer showed up on her door. And had she only been required to demonstrate to him that she was over 21 and not present any of her personal information, she'd have been fine. That's a zero knowledge proof, and that's why it's important.
Yep, and just continuing on that, the technology is here, right? Like, people are actively using it to prove these kinds of attributes selectively, not showing your date of birth, not showing your eye color if you're trying to open a bank account, right? So I think that from the policymaker perspective, right, understanding where we could help adjust the rules so that industry is comfortable leaning on this. I talk to compliance teams at banks, and they're terrified of this stuff because they never heard about it before, and it's different than what happens now, right? So to get them interested in the idea, even though there are clear benefits, easy onboarding, fraud gets cut to zero, doesn't matter if something happens, they end up sending money to North Korea because there's a million ways to break these systems, and now they're on the hook and they're criminally liable for it, right? So how do we look at this as, it is a good idea, what are the rules of the road around accepting digital ID for these use cases, and how do we encourage some of the financial institutions to do that, because that tends to be the driving force of adoption for tons of technologies.
Yeah, I love that point and that story, which I don't know if anyone here watches Doctor Who, hopefully everyone, but that's the Doctor Who magic paper that only shows you whatever the person wants to show you, and so hopefully whichever attributes are necessary to get access to whatever it is, and not something that would allow for bias or harmful, harassment or some other kind of harm to occur. That's really the thing that different privacy enhancing technologies like zero knowledge proofs, homomorphic encryption, multi-party computation, whatever, they all solve different parts of the privacy equation and allow you to do some really, really interesting computations on top of it. On the regulatory side, and given that there are rules of the road, there are too many times when the conversation basically is, zero knowledge proofs. So I can, don't worry, I checked that address isn't on an OFAC sanctions list. So I'm good on KYC. And that is not what KYC, that is not what knowing your customer means in a risk-based approach, but I appreciate the energy and the innovation, and it's the right line of thinking, and really, so it just requires a lot of people that understand governance and that understand these technologies to come together to address a really complex problem, in a really complex ecosystem, to figure out how you build in, for the rules of the road, that the right kind of information can be discoverable and accountable under certain conditions, which doesn't mean all information accountable to the government. We're not going to have a big brother type state. That's never going to be the future, but that's the right place to, I think, focus debate.
I'd like to see more conversations between functional regulators and technologists to bridge the gap that you just identified. Because I actually disagree that it couldn't be the standard. I would love to have a conversation with the right people at FinCEN about how to integrate zero knowledge proof technology into satisfying the demands of the Bank Secrecy Act. Because I'll tell you right now, the Bank Secrecy Act in KYC is focused on examination of identity documentation. It's actually not just knowing your customer. If you read the rules themselves, it is verifying identity through verifying presentation. It's assuming you're in front of someone, showing them a physical card and collecting information. In the exam manual, it talks about manner of examination of proof documents. And it talks about, are they in person? Are you getting the card? And if it's online, there's a whole set of rules about how to do it online. Well, now we're beyond that. And it's not clear to me that collecting a bunch of information about me is the best way to know what you need to know to do AML. And I'm not saying that that's I'm not arguing about what the law says. What I'm saying is I'd like to see a conversation open with this very open moment we have with the federal government to say, let's step back. Okay, we're trying to stop laundering of money and crime. There's a whole panoply of new technology out there that we could use. And instead of saying, well, you're not using the one that fits my definition, that's what rulemaking is for. And there's a way, I think, that we could have, like what the SEC is doing with securities, I think FinCEN should do it with AML, and ask, all right, in the crypto world and the fintech world, is there actually a better way to avoid the bouncer situation and still do our job of protecting the country against crime? I think there is, but that conversation only happens in adversarial exams right now, and I wish it was better.
I just want to give a little bit of credit to, at FinCEN, we had lots of innovation hours, and we published in 2004 that digital certificates were totally fine forms of documentation. We also have, in the rule, we say that non-documentary verification is part of it. Now, I love, the MSB manual hasn't been updated since maybe 2008. I'm with you that I think that there's a meeting of not just the policy as written in reg, but also the implementation, and with examiners especially, like there's a lot of gray space in there, and I love more collaboration. So I love that and more discussion. Just wanted to highlight that it's a complex issue, and I look forward to talking to you more about it,
Defend the
Joe.
institution, it's okay.
We're running out of time, and I promised a question. So if someone has a burning question, let me know. If not, we'll wrap it up with the panel. Okay, so one final thing in just a few words. What is your advice to policymakers right now in order to really build a privacy preserving trust in digital identity infrastructure? What would be one piece of advice you'd give to those in the audience or those listening online?
A surge and a focus on standards and R&D and collaboration to figure out the right framework.
I think it has to be working with industry to find the solution that people will accept and not picking the winning horse, but just allowing for a lot of different ways to meet the outcome that's desired. I always thought that was the role of policy, right? How do we represent our values? And then if we want to bet on the right way to get there, that's what markets are for.
I would say, since we're at a blockchain conference, I would say that the financial attention to blockchain innovation has been neglectful of identity and regtech, and those two areas need to catch up if we're going to have real comprehensive adoption.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it.